Hello, this is the unit on development where we will focus on enduring problematic imaginaries, development interventions, and notions of poverty and wealth. I'm using imaginaries here as a noun to mean the social container for what is considered real, ideal, sensible, desirable, and intelligible in society. Now, this is just a reminder that if any of the content in this presentation opens up cans of worms for you, this is part and parcel of the process, of the learning process. Please sit with the discomfort that this may create and try to transform the response of defensiveness, confusion, and anxiety into pause, humility, and disarmament. So that is the invitation of the course. So in the unit on education, which I don't know if you have seen, we talked about the metaphor of the yellow corn cob for the single story of progress, development, and human evolution, and how that is problematic as it limits our imagination to other forms of progress, development, and other ideas of being human that we may find or create in the world. And we also talked about patterns, problematic patterns in the encounters between yellow corn cobs and multicolored corn cobs in the acronym HEADS UP. So hegemonic, ethnocentric, ahistorical, depoliticized, salvationist, self-serving, and complicated and paternalistic patterns that we find empirically when we look at these encounters, right? So when we're talking about school linking, when we're talking about development interventions, these patterns are very present because of our attachment to the single story and to the universalization of the yellow corn cob as the only way, universal way to think about relationships, institutions, justice, knowing, and being. So today we start from there to talk about just the aspect of material poverty and material wealth in the relationship between the yellow and the multicolored corn cob. And if we look at the justifications for interventions, for development interventions that happen in this context, you see that the yellow corn cob will justify intervention saying it's their moral duty to help people who are in poverty, often perceived as a lack of stuff that the yellow corn cob has. Or the idea that helping them is good for us, a self-interested form of altruism. And many people on the other side would look at what's being offered and say, yes, we want that, right? So in my own journey, the way that I came to global citizenship education was actually through a School Links project that was hosted by the British Council in the UK that was supposed to link Brazilian and UK schools in projects about global citizenship. And the first time that in my first month of working in this project, I was flown to the UK. I was in Brazil as a teacher and now project coordinator. And the principals of the school, and this was 2000 or 1999 actually, and the principals wanted to link with schools in the Amazon out in the sticks, and they asked for schools without running water. And then it really disturbed me because I was wondering how this collaboration would take place. If the schools didn't have running water, then how would people communicate? Because probably then they wouldn't have internet or even like different languages, right? And then I asked the principals why they wanted to connect with schools in Brazil, like in the Amazon in Brazil, and the response was more or less in the line of we want our children in the UK to understand that they are very lucky, right, for being in the UK and not going through this hardship. So that's what I mean for the self-interested altruism. Because then I asked, okay, so you're you're going to tell your students that, and what are you going to tell the kids in Brazil? And they said, oh, don't worry about them. We'll send them old computers, old shoes, old materials, and this will be our way to reciprocate. And that really disturbed me. I was feeling, as an educator, challenged by what I was hearing, although it made sense according to the single story, right? So I went back and I thought that the teachers in Brazil should be consulted on this. And when I consulted the teachers I was working with, they said, to my surprise and not, the same thing. They said, oh, we would like to teach our students in Brazil what it means to be developed. And that if they are developed, they can teach us that. But basically they were saying that they can teach us we are underdeveloped. And they can send us these computers and shoes and other things. So I was having to face up to the fact that the story is adopted and embraced on both sides, right? And this has a history that is related to colonialism and imperialism and capitalism, right? But at the same time, there were a few voices that were saying no, but they were not being heard even within the group. So I got interested in those voices that were challenging the story, and they were saying that in order to be rich, in order to create wealth in this in the single story, necessarily as a condition, you have had to keep other people poor. So that the wealth of the rich countries is subsidized by poverty elsewhere. And I was really intrigued by that at the time, because for me, like, how come nobody had ever told me that? And is this actually true? Because at the time I was thinking, it's impossible that in my whole education I wouldn't have been exposed to this. And then I started working in a project as part of a project that was, it was a World Bank project in my state in Brazil, and I started to dig deeper into this through that kind of work, and I figured out that my education had failed me, that there was enough data to support this claim, but this data was not being presented, right? Because it didn't serve very powerful interests. So my history of politicization in this field has been pretty difficult as an educator, because I had to rethink the education I wanted for my students and my kids based on based on how my own education had failed me. So I'm just going to present the argument here that I found in a synthesis found in the book, Should Rich Nations Help the Poor? You also have a suggestion of a synthesis in a Guardian article that is suggested in the course. But David Holmes' book makes the argument that rich countries are responsible for the economic and political structures that have made countries and populations poor, that colonialism, developmentalism, contemporary capitalism, and globalization are the major causes of global poverty, global inequality, and social injustice, that the impacts of colonialism have created historical legacies that continue to impoverish poor nations through resource extraction, racism, ethnic division, slavery, and societal breakdown, illogical national boundaries, governments by narrow predatory elites that hold power, and other things. And also that the unfair world trade regime helps keep people who are poor, poor. And he gives an example, and I'm just going to quote this from the book. African cotton farmers are impoverished, while U.S. cotton farmers receive vast public subsidies to keep them going. The average cow in the European Union receives grants of $2.50 a day, more income than around 1/3 of humanity. Multinational corporations based in rich countries dominate business in many poor countries and illicitly help extract $10 from poor countries for every dollar of foreign aid the rich world provides. The world's leading pharmaceutical companies based in Europe and the US charge such high prices for their products that millions of poor people die unnecessarily. Rich country control over finance and technology ensures that poor countries cannot compete economically or meet the social needs of their populations. Furthermore, the policies pursued by the IMF and World Bank are tightly monitored by the US government and thus indirectly by US corporate interests. So in this context, it's important to expose students to different perspectives of where their security, their wealth, their privilege comes from. And we understand that not all students are privileged in the same way, but if our nation states, the wealth of our nation states is dependent on the impoverishment of other nations, we have to start questioning the economic models, especially the economic model of growth that keeps our economy growing. And I think the students have the right to know these other perspectives, at the same time that I don't think that we should be presenting these perspectives as the new truth. I think at this point in time with technology, we need to be able to support students to engage with knowledge in critical ways, in complex ways, but without imposing what students should think and do. So how do we create an environment where students can really explore where perspectives are coming from, where they're leading to, why people think in specific ways, what are the historical circumstances and political circumstances that lead people to hold certain perspectives, and how can things be thought in very different ways without us imposing our values on the students. And I'm not saying that because I want teachers to be neutral. That's not my position at all. It's just that it doesn't work, basically, to impose perspectives on young people at this day and age. I think we need to instigate their sense of responsibility and curiosity about what kind of world they're going to inherit and why, and leave to them the responsibility for creating the world, but with the caveat that they need to sit with the mistakes that have been repeatedly made so that they can make only different mistakes in the future. Like, making the same mistakes is both stupid and boring. So if they're bored, then they need to figure out why and how to open up spaces and cracks in the system so that other things are possible. And I think this has been more successful in my experience in terms of instigating interest than it has been to tell them what they should do and how they should think. But we can talk more about that during the tutorial. So modern slavery footprint and schooling the world are two resources that I would highly recommend to students. Not as the truth, but engage with this as a different way to look at reality that is also problematic in some senses, but that gives you subsidies for your thinking and imagination about what your responsibilities for the future are. And here I just included a cartography on poverty that looks at 4 different notions of poverty. And the first notion sees poverty as a lack of capacity for production and consumption. The second one is a lack of education and capability to participate in a given social order, or to have freedom in a given social order. The third one is systemic disempowerment and exploitation, and then poverty as disconnection. Since generally we're not used to the third and the fourth perspectives, I'm going to just provide examples of people who are arguing for these things. So here we have, for example, a sculpture that was made by Jens Gauchiot for the World Social Forum called Justitia, the goddess of justice, the European goddess of justice, actually, he says. And she's saying, I'm sitting on the back of a man, he's sinking under the burden, I will do anything to help him except to step down from his back. There are problems with the sculpture itself in terms of gender relations, and also other problematic normalization of bodies. So there's fat shaming in the structure. But it's important for us to open up spaces where we can talk about this rather than censor the sculpture. So I think this sculpture is an interesting example of the systemic disempowerment and exploitation as the basis of poverty and wealth accumulation that could also be used with students. And I would ask, for example, the students to redraw this image, taking account the problematic aspects that I mentioned. So that's one of the exercises that I do with my students, right? But keeping, for example, the holding of the justice scale, the idea that Justitia has her eyes closed. I had the student redrawing her with very big earphones, also not able to listen. I have students drawing a woman carrying a man with her mouth also gagged. So you can explore several things when you ask students to think through the systemic problems and transform a resource if this resource is problematic. I think that's what I'm trying to say. It's actually better to show something problematic to students and ask them to engage critically with that than try to find the perfect perspective or the perfect image to present where they feel then that there's nothing else they can do, right? So that's just one way of engaging students with these issues, where they feel that they can also take ownership of the process of analysis. The second one, example of disconnection is this, it's an ad from Survival International, which is actually quite old, and you can find it on the website. So it says, no debt, no bombs, no prisons, no poverty, no homelessness, no junk food, no pollution, no sweatshops. And people call them primitive. Racism kills tribal people, stamp it out. So it was a campaign to change the language that we use to talk about indigenous people and people from cultures that do not buy into the single story of progress, development, and human evolution, asking for us not to talk about them as primitive. There's a similar discussion about not talking about countries that have low income as third world or underdeveloped, because that actually reinforces the story. So some people say that we should talk about majority world, we should talk about low-income countries. Low-income is a description that doesn't challenge the story, but then also is not like third world or underdeveloped that actively reinforce the story. Majority world is used by many activists and scholars working with critical perspectives. So in this idea of poverty as disconnection, we have the argument that excess consumption, a production of waste actually, and individualism are a sign of existential poverty, which in turn creates material poverty that results in either violence or existential wealth. This means that as people are forced into situations of scarcity where you cannot depend on capital, you cannot depend on the state, we cannot depend on a structure or an institution to offer you security, they have to trust each other, they have to rely on each other. So what you see in communities that where there's material scarcity, it can go both ways. So sometimes you see a lot of violence, and sometimes you see a lot of community, right? So here in Vancouver, for example, we have the east side of Vancouver being a community where you can see a lot of homeless people, you can see a lot of people struggling with addiction, for example, but the community has had to keep together to fight gentrification. And therefore, it's in the same community where you see these differences and these struggles, you can also see a lot of solidarity, a lot of equanimity. You can see people actually looking out for each other. So this idea of seeing our privilege as a loss is something that scholar Gayatri Spivak has talked about, the idea that our privilege actually prevents us from imagining other ways of being and from enacting other ways of being in the world. And I think this perspective of wealth as disconnection goes in the same direction. So the idea is that when you cannot afford excess or individualism, consumerism, materialism, hedonism, and narcissism are not an option. And here, in my research, the perspectives that I've seen coming up that confirm this worldview, say, for example, that poverty is not knowing you are causing harm, poverty is not having enough to share, or poverty is being trapped in perpetual want. So that leaves us with several questions, I think, about whether we're rich or poor. To conclude this presentation, I would like to put in the middle now development, and this is a cartography that you have actually as part of the unit on development. And so the first perspective would see development as industrialization, entrepreneurship, microcredit, and everything that goes with the production of capital and the idea of entering markets. The second perspective is more, it's a softer one related to Western schooling and access to social mobility in that way. But then there are two other perspectives at the bottom. One is alternative development, where people and the communities themselves decide where they would like to go, what kind of development they want to pursue and how. Actually, it's more or less, it goes back to industrialization and access to means of production, but it gives the control over the process back to the community. And that's why it's called alternative development. It's the same ideal, or a little bit different. Like, it deviates very little from the single story, but there is a deviation and there's control of the community. It's not an imposed thing. Whereas alternatives to development are a completely different story. It's about seeing, being, and our relationship to the planet in a very different way. And in your unit, you will have a few examples, especially of Survival International, coming up with claims of indigenous communities and perspectives coming from indigenous communities that support the idea that we need a very different way to relate to each other and to the planet if we're going to be able to secure life in the planet for the 7 generations that are coming after us, right? And I think, as I said before, the idea here is not to romanticize or idealize these indigenous perspectives, but to sit with them, sit with the challenge they pose us, in order to remember that it is possible to think very differently about these things, whether or not we agree with them. Right? So they remind us that there are other types of practices and ways that have been invisibilized in our myopic yellow corn cob socialization that may be very important right now for us to remember or recreate as we face the unprecedented challenges that we are facing as humanity in this planet today. So I hope to see you very soon in the tutorial. Thank you.